Welcome, Life Sciences, to another exciting life science lesson. Right, today what are we looking at? We're looking at the end of microorganisms. We've come to the end of a section where we've traveled on a nice long journey, and we're just going to recap a little bit of what we've looked at in the past couple of lessons, what microorganisms are, what effect they have, etc. So let's just go and recap a little bit of those diagrams coming up, the characteristics, the structure. So what are we looking at? Okay, let's go on the journey that we were on with microorganisms. We started off, right, with viruses. Now remember, a microorganism is something that is really, really small. And usually you need a microscope to see it. Now that's the concept that we were looking at here. So we started off looking at viruses, and for each of our microorganisms, we needed to look at what were the characteristics, what did they look like, how could we identify them, and for each of those we concentrated on their pathogenic qualities. And what did I mean by that? We concentrated on the diseases they produced. So really, really small organisms, and we looked at these really huge big diseases that could have quite an impact right on our country and other countries. So after viruses, we looked at the concept of what a bacteria is, the whole kingdom bacteria, what a bacterium. Again, we looked at structure, characteristics, the disease. Then we looked at the kingdom protist, right, the microorganism protists. Then the last microorganism that we looked at was fungi. So all in all, we looked at the 4 different kinds of microorganisms, and the last lesson that we looked at was how important are all these microorganisms in our environment. Yes, they do cause disease, they are pathogenic, but they are essential and we cannot live without it. Okay, so let's get those terms going, right? Just a little bit of a recap. Let's see what have we done so far, and then we're going to work on a few questions later. All right, guys, so the first one we looked at was viruses, and when we looked at viruses, each of the things that we looked at, I don't know, you might have done the whole concept of classification, but viruses, out of all of our microorganisms, they do not belong to a kingdom. And the reason why they are so special is this concept over here, is that we looked at, there's a lot of discussion about it, but viruses are said to be non-living. And when we look at the kingdoms, right, our kingdom, we classify all living characteristics. So the viruses don't fall into a kingdom basically because they don't have those living characteristics. Out of all of our microorganisms, they are the smallest. Okay, so they are the smallest, and they unfortunately need a living host. Right, so a virus always needs to attack something. It always is going to produce disease. It's going to be bad for you if I have to use it in simple terms. Our other microorganisms have got good qualities and bad qualities. Our viruses, unfortunately, usually do cause disease. Now, when we looked at the structure, you don't have to know, right, the whole thing of the virus, but we looked at 3 things in particular. And the 3 things in particular was in the middle, there is this DNA over here. All viruses have either DNA or RNA. It's called nucleic acid, and it's DNA and RNA. All our other microorganisms only have DNA. Then they have a little protein coat around them to protect them, and then some of the viruses have a fat layer around them to protect them. So when we have a look at the virus, you simply have a structure around it, right, and you're going to have this DNA in the middle. So that is the basic structure. All right, so when it comes to viral diseases, for the diseases, remember, if you look at your notes, if you look at the textbook, if you look at the lessons, we actually discussed a variety of them. But technically speaking, you need to know one well. Maybe your school, all right, only concentrated on one. That is fine, all right? But you need to understand the concept of the viruses, what can cause them, right, and what is the management. And the diseases that we looked when it came to viruses, we looked at HIV/AIDS, right, which obviously quite a large portion in our country are HIV positive, so it has an impact on our health system. Then we looked at influenza, the flu, right? Maybe during winter months, we're going to see a lot more people might have the flu. With the COVID that we've had, maybe that's also linked to that. And then we looked at another one, rabies, right? Not as common as the rest, but as I said, you need to be able to do one of those diseases. And for each of them, you need to know two things. What causes it, right? We know it's a virus. What does it attack? Because viruses attack specific things. Then what does it do? What effect does it? Go through your notes, go through the lessons. Each time it says, these are the effects. Then how do I manage it? How do I stop the spread? How do I treat it? Right? What can I do? What can the government do? What are the implications? And then we can give you any kind of viral disease that you might not have heard of. But if you know how a virus works, you can then use, all right, the knowledge about a virus on those different questions. Right, our next microorganism was bacteria. They do belong to the kingdom, Malaria, right, the oldest kingdom. So they are the oldest living organisms. And then when we look at our characteristics, what are we talking about? The structure and the characteristics. Bacteria are prokaryotic and they are unicellular. What does that mean? Right, prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. They have nuclei material in the body, but then they do not have any kind of organelles. Going back to that whole concept. Bacteria, here we go. Some are useful, some are pathogenic, some are very useful. We cannot do without it. Now this is the key. This is a characteristic, guys. Bacteria can be treated with antibiotics. Viruses, no. Right, so no. So antibiotics are a medicine, a drug, right, whereby we are going to be able to treat bacteria. So because it's living, and it's a simple concept, we can treat it, right? And the treatment is obviously going to be with antibiotics. Also, because they are living, they can reproduce by themselves. Bacteria don't need, all right, a living host to reproduce. There's one bacteria, and what it does is it splits into two, and that's how the bacteria is going to divide. Nice and quickly and efficiently, and we make a copy of itself. Another characteristic about bacteria, right, are these diagrams here at the top, and very often we give a bacteria a name according to its shape. So you'll see here, if they're rod-shaped, we often call it a bacillus. You'll see when we do TB, it's called Mycobacterium, or tuberculosis, and it's a bacillus. It's a rod-shaped one. Some of them are round. We say they are coccus. And then we have spirelli. They're spiral shaped. So the name tells a lot about itself. And sometimes there's one, it's a little bit rare. It's on one of the STDs. And it's a comma, right? It's a comma. And it's called a Vibrio. But it's not one that we often discuss. Now, guys, if you have a look at this diagram, it's often called a typical bacterium, because that's what we use for a single cell, the bacterium. And you need to be able to label this structure. You need to be able to label it. Sometimes draw it, okay, not often, but you need to be able to recognize it. What are the structures and what are the characteristics of a bacteria cell? Our next group of microorganisms was the protists. And this was the funny group because this kind of like had things that were totally unrelated into it. So when we looked at bacteria, the only thing in that kingdom was bacteria. the Malaria kingdom. Now, when we look at the protists, we saw that they had very differing characteristics. So much so that when we looked at it, we actually divided it into two groups. So first of all, right, when we looked at the characteristics, what did they all have in common? Because as I said, let's do like a mind map here. So we have, right, a few traits. These are the ones. They are eukaryotic. So for the first time, what do we see? We see a cell that has a definite nucleus, and we have all these organelles inside because it's got to do a lot more functions. So it's a eukaryotic cell. Even though we say a simple single-celled, right, it is a bit more advanced than our prokaryotic. All of the protists live in a moist environment. Generally, they live in an aquatic water. Some can even live in really moist soil. And here, again, they also reproduce asexually. So that is the characteristics that they all had. All right, guys, so now we've got to look at the diseases that bacteria caused. Now, as I said to you before, you are given a variety of diseases that you need to study, and you need to choose one. I'm not going to show favoritism, but I would suggest that maybe you look at the tuberculosis, the TB. It is a disease prevalent in our country, and it would be a lot more, all right, relevant for you to study. The other bacterial diseases that we looked at were anthrax, right, which we get in cattle. We looked at cholera, which we can get if we eat food or we drink water that's contaminated. And the last one we looked at, plants also can get, all right, a fungus, and we call that blight. Our next group that we're going to look at is the protists. Now, protists are a weird kingdom because there are a lot of different kinds of organisms that fit in here. Bacteria was quite simple, right? The Malaria kingdom, if you're a bacteria here. In the protists, we have quite a variety of organisms that we actually divided into subcategories, but we're going to look at that just now. So when I look at protists, right, what do I have? I'm going to have, all right, over here, my group of protists. And all these characteristics over here that I've got all belong to this group. But then I'm going to split into two, and I'm going to see the variety there. So when I talk about a protist for the first time, we see a cell that is eukaryotic. What does that mean? All right, it's a cell that has a nucleus, and it also has all of the membrane-bound structures that the cells can have. Right, protists still live in aquatic medium. They can't survive where it's dry, so they usually live in water. And like the bacteria, they also can reproduce, all right, asexually. That means they don't need a male and we don't need a female. So what are these two divisions that we're talking about over here? Right, so what happens is when we look at the protists, we can divide them into plant-like protists and animal-like protists. So not plants yet and not animals yet, but they have certain characteristics that make them more plant-like or more animal-like. So if we have a look at the plants, right, the plant group we call algae. So that's the single name that we use for them. We say that the plant protists, they are algae. And the examples over here are, you'll see at the top, are diatoms because they're nice and single ones, or really, really big ones are the seaweeds. Now, what can the algae do? Guys, algae can photosynthesize. They've got chlorophyll, they're usually green, and they can make their own food. Now, when we look at algae here, you will see these are unicellular, and these are multicellular. These are microscopic, and these are macroscopic. So here, scopic. So what we've got is really small and really big. So that's what I say to you. When it comes here, we haven't got this continuation of everything's the same thing. Again, these are able to reproduce asexually, and as I say to you, they can be really diverse, really small or really big. One single cell or many cells together. And those are usually, I said to you, single cells, diatoms, and the large ones are the seaweed, but we call them algae. The animal ones we call protozoans. That's what we call them. The animal-like protists, there's a group, right? They're called, we say here, they are protozoans. And we're going to divide them into 4 different groups. Now, what else do they have that is a little bit animalistic, if I use that word? Guys, they are heterotrophic. What does that mean? They have to eat. They cannot make their own food. Whereas the algae could, the animal part cannot make its food. All right, so it needs to eat. So basically what the protozoa, they're going to be little unicellular. Guys, these are really small. They're not like the plants. They are one single cell, and they're going to swim around looking for food. And these are the 4 examples that we're going to look at. They can be parasitic. This is the plasmodium. This is the important one because this is the malaria that we can look at. The amoeba ones, all right, they go and they eat their food, they slink around it. The paramecium, right, this is little cilia, they've got little cilia to move, or the flagellate, they're going to move via their tail. But the parasite one, that is the one that we really needed to look at. Also in this group are 2 really important unicellular organisms, are plankton. They are found in the oceans. They're a really important part of the food chain. And again, you get the plant type and the animal type. The plant, phytoplankton, the animal, zooplankton, because that's where you put animals in the zoo. Guys, when it came to a disease, we only looked at one disease here, and that was malaria. And as I said to you, it plays a very important part in our society. We have usually in the northern province, we do have a mosquito problem, and mosquitoes carry, right, especially the female, carries that plasmodium, the parasite, not the mosquito, right? The mosquito has that protozoa inside that it gives to somebody, right, when they bite. Our last group of microorganisms are fungi. Now, they kind of like also a little bit off scale here because some of them we can see. They're actually not microscopic. When it comes to mushrooms, when it comes to mold when your vegetables or in your things in your fridge or your lunch tin might get all that green furry, we can see it. So it's actually here we have a little bit of a difference to the rest. Most of the times we can see it. There is a unicellular one, right, and that is yeast. And yeast, if we looked at the importance, played a very, very important role. Guys, they're also eukaryotes, right? As I said, we can see them. They cannot make their own food. Fungi have got various ways that they need to get food. They live off dead organic matter. Some of them are parasites. They live on you, right? But they cannot make their own food, and they have a variety of ways in which they are going to get that food. Now, very important, fungi, what do they like? Oh, nice, warm, moist, dark conditions. That is where they are going to, all right, flourish the most. When we looked at the structure, all right, of fungi, we looked specifically at bread mold, and basically what it does, it puts all of these strands into the bread, and it's looking to get the glucose. That's what it does. It gets the food out, and when it needs to reproduce, it produces this long stalk. Right at the top, it's got all these spores in. Can you see that? And when it needs to reproduce, it bursts open, and the spores fall on the bread, and new fungi are going to then, right, emerge. Then we looked at some diseases. Again, there was a few that we could look at. You really need to concentrate on one. And we noticed that these diseases weren't killer diseases like the other ones we looked at. They were more of an irritation, right? Fungi could be treated with, right, and not like antifungal cream, usually quite easy to obtain and then to cure. What we looked at thrush. which was a yeast infection, right? We looked at rust. We saw that plants also can get a fungus. Then we looked at ringworm, which is not a worm, but a fungus that grows on our skin. And then we looked at athlete's foot, when we don't dry in our toes so nicely and it starts to nibble on our skin. Okay, guys, that's all for now. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.